Some love stories are written in church hymnals with golden rings and white lace. Others are carved into saloon floors with muddy boots and whispered promises. When Mary told Jacob she'd wait for him, she wasn't asking for forever. She was declaring war on a town that believed a dance hall girl could never love a preacher's son. But what Cedar Ridge didn't know was that their forbidden love had been growing in secret for 3 years. And tomorrow, when Jacob left for the Civil War, they'd have to choose. Bow to everyone else's shame, or fight for a love the whole world said was impossible. The piano in Murphy's saloon had 3 broken keys, but Mary O'Sullivan made it sing anyway. Her fingers danced across the yellowed ivory while men in dusty boots stomped and hollered around tables sticky with spilled whiskey. The emerald green dress she wore, the only pretty thing she owned, caught the lamplight as she swayed with the music, making her auburn hair shimmer like copper pennies. But Mary wasn't watching the cowboys or the card players or the drifters spending their last coins on rotgut liquor. She was watching the church across the street. Through the saloon's grimy windows, she could see the white steeple rising against the sunset sky, and if she timed it just right, she'd catch a glimpse of Jacob McKinnon walking past on his evening rounds, checking that the church doors were locked and the hymnal books were properly stacked. Jacob, the preacher's son who wasn't supposed to notice saloon girls, and definitely wasn't supposed to love one. But he did. Mary had known it for 3 years, ever since the night he'd found her crying behind the general store after old Mrs. Henderson had spit at her feet and called her Murphy's whore loud enough for half the town to hear. She'd been 17 then, new to Cedar Ridge, working at the saloon because it was the only job that would take a girl with no family and no references. She wasn't like the other dance hall girls. She didn't entertain men upstairs, didn't drink with the customers, didn't laugh at their crude jokes. She just played piano and served drinks and tried to save enough money to maybe, someday, get out. That night behind the general store, with tears streaming down her face and shame burning in her chest, Jacob had appeared like an angel in his crisp white shirt and black vest. "Miss," he'd said softly, "are you hurt?" Mary had looked up at him, tall, gentle-faced, with kind blue eyes that didn't hold judgment, and felt something crack open in her heart. "I'm fine," she'd lied, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "No, you're not." He'd crouched down beside her, not caring that his clean clothes might touch the dirt. "What happened?" She'd stared at him, this preacher's son who should have walked away the moment he recognized her, should have hurried past with his eyes averted, the way respectable people did. Instead, he'd waited, patient as sunrise. "Mrs. Henderson thinks I'm something I'm not," Mary had finally whispered. "What do you think you are?" The question had caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. I think I'm just trying to survive." Jacob had nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense to him. "I think," he'd said, "you're braver than anyone in this town." That was the beginning. For 3 years, they'd found ways to see each other. Jacob would happen to walk past the saloon when Mary stepped outside for air. Mary would happen to be at the well when Jacob came to fetch water for the church. They'd exchange careful words, careful glances, careful smiles that no one else was supposed to see. And slowly, impossibly, they'd fallen in love. Now, as Mary played the broken piano and watched the church across the street, her heart hammered with a desperate rhythm. Tomorrow, Jacob would board the train east to join the Union Army. The whole town was talking about it. How proud Preacher McKinnon was of his boy. How noble it was for the minister's son to serve his country. What they didn't know was that before Jacob left, he'd asked Mary to meet him at the old oak tree behind the church. Tonight, after the saloon closed and the town slept. What they didn't know was that Jacob McKinnon, the golden boy of Cedar Ridge, was about to risk everything for a girl in a green dress who played piano in a place his father called the Devil's Parlor. "Mary," Murphy's gruff voice cut through her thoughts. "Stop mooning at that church and play something the boys can dance to." Mary's fingers found a livelier tune, but her mind stayed across the street. In just a few hours, she'd slip out the back door and run through the shadows to meet the only man who'd ever looked at her and seen something worth loving. But what she didn't know was that Preacher McKinnon had seen them together. What she didn't know was that the good Reverend had spent the afternoon writing letters to every respectable family in 3 counties, trying to find his son a proper wife before Jacob could make the biggest mistake of his life. What she didn't know was that tomorrow's train didn't just carry soldiers to war. It carried young men away from the kinds of women their fathers believed would ruin them. As the saloon grew louder and the night grew darker, Mary played on, her emerald dress catching the light, her heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. Across the street, Jacob sat in his father's study, staring at a letter that had arrived that afternoon. A letter that would change everything. A letter from Colonel Morrison offering him a position as a chaplain's assistant, far from the front lines, far from danger, far from Mary. The letter promised safety, respectability, and a future his father would approve of. But as Jacob folded the paper with trembling hands, he realized something that would have horrified his father. He'd rather die fighting for his country than live safely without the girl in the green dress who'd stolen his heart in a town that would never understand. He tucked the letter into his vest pocket, next to his father's silver watch, and prepared to meet Mary at the oak tree. What he was about to tell her would either save them both or destroy them completely. But some risks, he'd learned, were worth taking, even if the whole world called you a fool for taking them. That night, Mary waited. The saloon had emptied hours ago, leaving behind the smell of whiskey and the echo of laughter that never quite reached her heart. She sat by her small window, still wearing the emerald green dress, watching the church across the street where a single light burned in the preacher's study. Jacob would come. He always came. At midnight, she heard the soft knock, 3 taps, then 2. Their signal. She opened the door to find him standing in the shadows, white shirt glowing in the moonlight, silver pocket watch catching the lamplight from her room. But something was different tonight. His blue eyes held a weight she'd never seen before. "Mary," he whispered, stepping inside. "We need to talk." She closed the door, heart pounding. In 3 years of secret meetings, he'd never looked this serious. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. He took her hands in his, those gentle hands that had never judged her, never made her feel small. "I got my orders today. I leave for the war in 3 days." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known this day would come, but knowing and feeling were different creatures entirely. 3 days, she repeated, voice barely audible. "Mary, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said years ago." She looked up at him, this man who had somehow seen past the saloon girl exterior to whatever lay beneath. "What?" "I love you." The words came out rushed, desperate. "I've loved you since the day you helped that drunk cowboy who'd lost his way home. I've loved you through every Sunday sermon my father preached about redemption, knowing he'd never see yours. I've loved you through every cruel word this town has whispered about you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Jacob." "Let me finish," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "I love you, and I'm going to marry you when I come back from this war." She pulled away, shaking her head. "You can't. You know you can't. Your father would disown you. The church would cast you out. Your whole future. My future is meaningless without you in it." But what he didn't know was that his father had already seen them together, had already made plans. What he was about to learn would either save them both or destroy them forever. The next morning, Jacob sat across from his father in the study that smelled of leather and judgment. Preacher McKinnon was a tall, severe man whose black clothes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His gray eyes, so different from Jacob's warm blue ones, studied his son with cold calculation. "The Hendersons have offered their daughter's hand in marriage," the preacher said without preamble. "Sarah is a good Christian girl, pure, suitable for a minister's wife. Jacob's blood turned to ice. Father, the engagement will be announced before you leave for war. When you return, you'll marry her and take over the church. It's all arranged. I haven't agreed to any of this. Preacher McKinnon leaned forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that had silenced congregations. Haven't you? You think I don't know about your visits to that place across the street? Jacob's heart stopped. Father, that woman, the preacher spat, that saloon girl who sells herself for coins and whiskey. You think I haven't seen you sneaking around like a common thief in the night? She doesn't sell herself, Jacob said, rising to his feet. She serves drinks. She dances. Nothing more. Dancing with men, serving alcohol, living in sin above a den of iniquity. What would you call it? I'd call it surviving, Jacob said, his voice stronger now. Something she's had to do since she was 16 and had nowhere else to go. The preacher stood as well, towering over his son. You will not disgrace this family. You will not throw away your calling for a woman who has no virtue to offer. She has more virtue in her little finger than half the women who sit in your pews every Sunday. The slap came hard and fast, rocking Jacob backward. You will marry Sarah Henderson, his father said, voice deadly calm. You will forget this infatuation with that creature, and if you don't, I'll make sure she leaves town permanently. Do you understand me? Jacob stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. This man who preached love and forgiveness, who spoke of redemption and grace, this man who would destroy an innocent woman to protect his reputation. I understand, Jacob said quietly. I understand exactly who you are. He turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Jacob paused, hand on the doorknob. To tell the woman I love that her worth isn't determined by men like you. If you walk out that door, don't come back. If you choose her, you choose exile. Jacob looked back at his father one last time. Then I choose exile. But as he stepped outside, he didn't see the cold smile that crossed Preacher McKinnon's face. The old man had one more card to play, one that would remove the saloon girl from the equation permanently, and Jacob would never see it coming. That evening, Mary sat on her narrow bed, staring at the emerald green dress she'd carefully folded. Tomorrow, Jacob would leave for war. Tonight might be their last chance to say goodbye. She touched the gold locket at her throat, the only thing left of her mother, the only reminder that she'd once been somebody's treasure. Her mother had worn this same dress, this same green that brought out the warmth in her eyes. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Not Jacob's gentle signal. This was harsh, demanding. She opened the door to find Preacher McKinnon standing in the hallway, his black coat making him look like death itself. Behind him stood two men she didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with guns at their hips. Miss Thompson, the preacher said, his voice dripping false politeness. We need to have a conversation. Mary's blood turned cold. About what? About my son's future, and your interference with it. The strangers pushed past her into the small room, their eyes scanning her belongings with professional assessment. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, picked up her few dresses and tossed them into a worn leather bag. What are you doing? Mary demanded, but her voice came out smaller than she intended. Helping you relocate, Preacher McKinnon said, settling into her only chair as if he owned the place. You see, Miss Thompson, tomorrow my son leaves for war, and you'll be leaving tonight. I'm not going anywhere. The preacher smiled, a cold, calculating expression that never reached his gray eyes. Oh, but you are. These gentlemen work for the railroad. They are quite persuasive when it comes to helping people find new opportunities. The scarred man looked up from packing her things. Train leaves in 2 hours, miss. Denver's a big city. Lots of opportunities for a girl with your skills. Mary's heart pounded. Jacob will look for me. Jacob will receive a letter explaining that you found a better situation, that you realized a preacher's son deserves better than a saloon girl's affection. The preacher pulled a folded paper from his coat. Your handwriting, I believe, is quite distinctive. Mary snatched the letter, recognizing her own script, words she'd never written, sentiments she'd never felt. How did you? Your grocery lists, my dear. The shopkeeper was quite helpful. Amazing what people will do for the right price. She crumpled the forged letter. He'll never believe this. Won't he? A young man going off to war, full of noble purpose, when he reads that the woman he thought he loved has abandoned him for money and comfort. The preacher's voice was silk over steel. Men want to believe women are better than they are, Miss Thompson. But they also expect them to disappoint. The second man, shorter but meaner looking, finished packing her few possessions. Time to go, miss. And if I refuse? Preacher McKinnon stood slowly, towering over her. Then I'll tell the sheriff that you've been stealing from the saloon. Amazing how quickly evidence can appear when needed. Denver or jail, Miss Thompson. Your choice. Mary looked around the tiny room that had been her home for 4 years. Not much, but it was hers. The window where she'd watched for Jacob's signal. The chair where she'd sewn torn dresses by candlelight. The floor where they danced quietly to music only they could hear. I need to leave him a message. A real one. I'm afraid that's not possible. She lifted her chin, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Then I'll scream. I'll wake the whole saloon. I'll tell everyone what you're doing. The preacher's eyes narrowed. And who would believe you? The town drunk who owns this place? The working girls who'd sell their own mothers for a silver dollar? He leaned closer. You're nothing here, Miss Thompson. Less than nothing. A convenience at best, a nuisance at worst. But Mary was no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge 4 years ago. She'd learned things in that time. About survival, about courage, about love that doesn't ask permission. She walked to her small dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembling, she wrote quickly. Jacob, they took me, but they can't take what we have. I'll wait for you. Find me. You're Mary. Before the preacher could stop her, she pressed the note into a crack in the floorboard beneath her bed, pushing it deep where only someone looking carefully would find it. Touching, the preacher said, but useless. Jacob leaves at dawn for the train station. He'll never see this room again. The scarred man grabbed Mary's arm. Time's up, miss. As they led her toward the door, Mary took one last look at the window facing the church. Jacob's light was still burning in his room. He was probably packing, preparing for war, thinking about their future. He'll know, she said quietly. Somehow, he'll know this isn't real. Will he? The preacher's voice followed her down the stairs. Or will he decide that losing you was God's way of keeping him on the righteous path? But as they pushed her toward the waiting wagon, neither the preacher nor his hired men saw the small figure watching from the shadows across the street. Molly Patterson, the saloon's youngest girl, had seen everything. And Molly had always liked Mary, the only person in town who'd treated her with kindness instead of pity. What the preacher didn't know was that Molly could read. And what he couldn't predict was that some people keep their promises, even when the world tells them not to. The train would leave in 2 hours, but Jacob's love was about to face its greatest test. Jacob woke before dawn, his heart heavy with the weight of leaving. Today he would board the train to join the Union Army. Today he would leave Mary behind, not knowing when, or if, he would return. He dressed carefully in his traveling clothes, folding his white shirts and black vest into his leather satchel. The silver pocket watch his father had given him lay on the dresser, catching the early morning light. He almost left it behind. It felt like a chain now, a reminder of expectations he could no longer meet. But something made him slip it into his pocket anyway. A soft knock at his door interrupted his packing. "Come in," he called, expecting his father with more cold instructions about duty and reputation. Instead, it was Molly Patterson, the youngest girl from the saloon. Her face was streaked with tears, her usually neat brown hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "Mr. Jacob," she whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. "I need to tell you something. About Mary." Jacob's blood turned to ice. "What about Mary? Is she hurt?" "They took her," Molly said, her voice breaking. "Last night. Your father and 2 men. They forced her on the train to Denver." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He sank onto his bed, staring at the girl. "What are you talking about?" "I saw everything. They came to her room, packed her things, told her she had to leave. She didn't want to go, Mr. Jacob. She fought them." Jacob's hands were shaking now. "That's impossible. My father wouldn't." "There's more." Molly pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her dress pocket. "They left this for you, but I found another note, hidden in her room." Jacob took the paper with trembling fingers. His father's harsh handwriting filled the page. "Jacob, I've found better opportunities in Denver. A preacher's son deserves a respectable wife, not a saloon girl with no future. Don't look for me. This is for the best. Mary." "This isn't her handwriting," Jacob said, studying the careful script. "Mary writes with loops. She dots her I's with little circles. This is." He looked up at Molly. "You said there was another note." Molly nodded, reaching into her other pocket. "I went back to her room after they left. Found this under the floorboard by her bed." Jacob's heart stopped as he read Mary's real message. "Jacob, they took me, but they can't take what we have. I'll wait for you. Find me. You're Mary." The familiar handwriting, the little circles over the I's, the way she always signed her name with a flourish. This was real. This was Mary. "He took her," Jacob said, the words coming out like a prayer and a curse combined. "My own father took her." "What are you going to do?" Molly asked. Jacob stood, his jaw set with determination. "I'm going to Denver." "But the war, your orders." "Can wait." He grabbed his satchel, his mind racing. "Molly, can you do something for me?" She nodded eagerly. "Tell everyone who asks that I went to war as planned. Don't let anyone know I went to Denver first. But your father will know when you don't get on the army train." "My father," Jacob said, his voice hard as winter stone, "has already lost his son." The train to Denver was crowded with soldiers, farmers, and dreamers all heading west. Jacob sat by the window, staring out at the endless prairie, Mary's real note pressed against his heart. For 3 days, the train carried him farther from everything he'd ever known. Each mile took him deeper into a world where his father's influence meant nothing, where Preacham Kinnan was just another angry man whose power ended at the county line. Denver was bigger than Jacob had imagined. A sprawling city of miners and merchants, saloons and churches, hope and desperation all mixed together like ingredients in a bitter stew. The train station bustled with activity, and Jacob felt suddenly small and lost in the crowd. Where would Mary be in a city this size? How would he even begin to look? He spent his first day walking the streets, asking in every saloon, every boarding house, every place a woman alone might find work. Most people shook their heads or looked at him suspiciously. A few demanded money for information they didn't have. On his second day, he found the Goldmine Saloon on the rough side of town. The bartender, a grizzled man with kind eyes, listened to Jacob's description of Mary and nodded slowly. "Green dress, you said? Auburn hair. Pretty girl with sad eyes." Jacob's heart leaped. "Yes. Have you seen her?" "She was here for about a week. Good girl. That one. Wouldn't do nothing but serve drinks and clean tables, no matter what the customers offered to pay for." The bartender wiped down a glass thoughtfully. "But she left yesterday." "Left?" Where did she go? Said she was going to work for a family up in the hills. The widow Morrison, I think, needs help with her ranch since her husband died in a mining accident. Jacob felt hope flood through him like warm sunlight. How do I get there? The bartender gave him directions to a ranch 20 miles outside the city. But son, he added as Jacob turned to leave, that girl you're looking for? She spent every evening sitting by that window, watching the street like she was waiting for someone. You the someone she was waiting for? Jacob touched the hidden note against his chest. I hope so. Then you better hurry. Word is, there's been some trouble up at the Morrison place. Claim jumpers trying to force the widow off her land. Jacob's blood ran cold. Mary was in danger again, and he was still too far away to protect her. But this time, nothing would stop him from reaching her. Not his father's lies, not the war, not an army of claim jumpers. What Jacob would find at the Morrison Ranch would test everything he believed about courage, love, and the price of choosing your own path. The Morrison Ranch sat in a valley between two hills, smoke rising from the chimney like a prayer against the gray sky. Jacob rode hard, his borrowed horse breathing heavily beneath him, the sound of gunshots echoing from the ranch buildings ahead. He arrived to find Mary standing on the porch, a rifle in her hands, still wearing that emerald green dress that had become his beacon across impossible distances. 3 men on horseback circled the ranch house, shouting demands about property rights and legal claims. Get off my land! The widow Morrison called from beside Mary, her own shotgun trained on the lead rider. Jacob didn't think. He spurred his horse forward, drawing the old pistol he'd bought in Denver, and fired a warning shot into the air. That's my wife you're threatening, he called out, his voice carrying across the valley with authority he'd never known he possessed. The claim jumpers turned, assessing this new threat. The leader, a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, spat into the dust. Your wife? This some kind of joke? No joke, Jacob said, dismounting slowly, the gun steady in his hand. And if you don't ride out now, you'll find out just how serious I am. What followed was tense and brief. 3 men with questionable legal documents against 1 man with absolute certainty about what he was fighting for. In the end, they rode away, muttering about returning with more men and better lawyers. But they never did. Mary ran to Jacob before the dust had settled, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he nearly lost his balance. She smelled like soap and sunshine and home. You came, she whispered against his chest. I promised I would find you, he said, holding her like he'd never let go again. Did you think I wouldn't? Your father said. My father, Jacob said firmly, was wrong about everything that matters. They married that same evening in the widow Morrison's parlor, with only the old woman and her foreman as witnesses. No church, no congregation, no father's blessing. Just Jacob and Mary and words spoken with more conviction than any ceremony could provide. The widow Morrison, grateful for their help with the claim jumpers, offered them work and a small cabin on the far edge of her property. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a view of the mountains that took Mary's breath away every morning. But it was theirs. Jacob learned to work the land, his soft preacher's sun hands growing calloused and strong. Mary learned to cook over an open fire, to tend chickens, to plant vegetables that would feed them through the winter. They were poor in everything except what mattered most. In the evenings, Mary would sit by the window, sketching the mountains, the cattle, Jacob's hands as he whittled wooden spoons by firelight. Her art had always been her escape, but now it became her celebration. She drew their life together, every small joy, every quiet moment, every proof that love could build something beautiful from nothing. People in the nearby town started asking to buy her drawings. Families wanted portraits, ranchers wanted pictures of their prize horses, mothers wanted sketches of their children. Mary's art became their income, her talent the foundation of their security. "You never told me you could do this," Jacob said one evening, watching her put the finishing touches on a portrait of the Morrison family. "You never asked what I dreamed about," Mary replied, not looking up from her work. "You only asked what I needed." They never had children of their own, but their small cabin became a refuge for others. Young couples eloping against their family's wishes would find sanctuary there. Runaway slaves heading north would discover food and shelter and no questions asked. Women fleeing bad marriages would arrive frightened and leave stronger. Mary and Jacob never turned anyone away. The years passed quietly. Jacob's dark hair turned silver. Mary's auburn curls faded to gray. They grew old together in that little cabin, their love deepening like roots in rich soil. People in town stopped whispering about the preacher's son and the saloon girl. Instead, they spoke of the couple who fixed broken hearts, who painted pictures that captured more than just faces, who proved that love didn't need society's approval to flourish. Mary died first, on a spring morning, her sketch pad on her lap and a drawing of Jacob's weathered hands beneath her fingers. She passed peacefully, looking out the window at the mountains she'd drawn 1,000 times. Jacob found her there, still beautiful in her emerald green dress that she'd kept all these years, still the woman who'd waited for him in a world that said their love was impossible. He lived 2 more years, tending her grave, finishing her last sketches, helping one more young couple find their way to happiness despite the world's objections. When he died, they buried him beside her in the little cemetery overlooking the valley. The headstone, carved by a grateful stonemason whose marriage they'd once saved, reads simply, "Jacob and Mary McKinnon, they chose love." The cabin still stands, they say, though new families live there now. Sometimes, when the evening light hits the windows just right, people claim they can see 2 figures sitting by the fireplace, one sketching, one whittling, both at peace with the choices that led them there. Their story became legend in that part of Colorado, not the kind of legend about gunfighters or gold strikes, but the quieter kind about 2 people who proved that love doesn't ask permission from anyone. And sometimes, when young couples face impossible odds, older folks in town will tell them about the preacher's son and the saloon girl who built a life from nothing but devotion. "Love doesn't care about your station," they'll say. "It only cares about your heart." And that's how love wins in the end. Not with grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but with 2 people who choose each other every day, no matter what the world says is proper or possible. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin with the words, "I'll still wait for you." If Mary and Jacob's journey touched your heart, you're not alone. Love stories like theirs remind us that true devotion doesn't ask for society's approval, it simply chooses to endure. Here at Ironwood Narratives, we believe everyone deserves to hear stories about people who were told they weren't good enough, weren't the right fit, weren't worthy of love, but found it anyway. Stories about the outcast who became someone's everything, the forgotten who became unforgettable, the unwanted who discovered they were exactly what someone had been waiting for their whole life. If you believe that love sees what others overlook, that courage sometimes looks like waiting, and that the most beautiful endings often have the simplest beginnings, then hit that subscribe button. Because in a world that often tells us we're not enough, we all need to hear stories about people who found someone who saw them as exactly enough of everything good. New Wild West love stories every week. Stories of hearts that chose each other against all odds. Subscribe now, and never miss a tale of love that refused to give up.